It began on a late summer Thursday, the 11th of September 1980, just 2 months before Americans would choose their next president. Ronald Reagan, still a candidate then, sat down to write a letter. His addressee was General Clifton von Kahn, Senior Vice President at the Air Transport Association of America. The tone was measured but unmistakably firm. Reagan laid out what he thought aviation needed and what, in his view, had gone wrong. He praised flight as a pillar of national strength, both economic and military, yet he lamented a drift that had crept into the nation's aeronautical work. The country that once sold airplanes to the world now faced a worrying slowdown in exports. Programs underway were important, yes, but they were not enough. He singled out energy-efficient aircraft as essential, describing a technological base that, in his words, was languishing. The trends had to be reversed, he promised von Kahn, and he pledged that, if he won, he would see to it. If these quiet journeys through the history of flight and policy soothe you, and you want more gentle stories that you can fall asleep to, consider subscribing to Space Historian and Tapping Like. It helps keep these calm explorations aloft without breaking the flow of our tale. Soon after Reagan took office, a bracing wind of skepticism blew in from the policy world. A conservative think tank that exerted real influence on his administration's philosophy offered a startling claim. NASA's aeronautics work, they argued, was not saving American leadership in the skies. It was eroding it. Their conclusion was blunt. The program should be abolished. Inside Washington's corridors, this idea did not remain idle. The new administration began to ask whether aeronautics ought to be taken out of NASA's hands and left primarily to industry. The implications were enormous. At Langley, where engineers had nurtured airflow ideas across generations, Richard Wagner, who led the Laminar Flow Control effort, remembered the feeling as Reagan arrived. Survival was no longer a given. At Lewis Research Center, the anxiety was sharper still. The very base came under threat of closure. What had begun in 1979 as a slow-moving disagreement over the wording of a report grew into budget skirmishes in 1980, and finally, by 1981, into something closer to a fight for existence. Proposals surfaced to shutter Lewis, to excise aeronautics from NASA entirely, and to eliminate more than 1,000 aeronautics jobs. The engineers and managers, who had spent their lives coaxing subtle improvements from wings and engines, found themselves living through what would be remembered as the aeronautics wars. To understand how the pressure built to that point, one has to go back a year before the letter and the election, to the summer of 1979, when a single acronym, GEO, began to loom large over aeronautics. For much of NASA's history, the agency's air research had run quietly in the background, its budgets modest, its oversight correspondingly light. Aeronautics had been reliable, purposeful, and, by Washington standards, small. That changed with ACEE, the Aircraft Energy Efficiency Program. ACEE had heft. It tackled fuel savings at a time when fuel costs were reshaping aviation's economics and the public's expectations. With the larger budget came attention, and not all of it friendly. In June of that year, NASA leaders asked several program heads to look ahead and say, plainly, where they thought aeronautics should go next. The question reached Donald Norrid, who directed ACEE work at Lewis. He answered in a letter that did not read like a sales pitch. Instead, he offered a candid map of what he believed the agency should do. NASA, he said, ought to concentrate on problems of major national need and, within those, to favour the bold. The breakthrough, the novel, the high-risk ideas that, if they worked, would return high payoff. He did not hesitate to critique the way things had drifted. There was too much of a hodgepodge in the portfolio, Too many threads, too many incremental responses to what industry wanted next. Aeronautics should be, in his view, more revolutionary. Then he turned to the concern that overshadowed all others in 1979: fuel. Fuel costs were more than price charts. They were an existential pressure on airlines, and by extension on the mobility of a nation. The core crises of the decade, oil shocks, stagflation, recessionary winds, had bent the shape of flight. If the physics of lift and drag were constant, the economics of kerosene were not. The problem of fuel, Norrid wrote in essence, stood above the rest. He saw ACEE as an important beginning, not a finished stage. He called for vigorous support, continued, sustained, and pleaded for something he named agency urgency, a clarity of focus that would match the magnitude of the moment. 2 months later, in August, the GAO released a draft review of ACEE. It was the first in a set of reviews planned for NASA's aeronautics work, and the auditors began with the program that had the most visibility. Their mission, under the direction of the House Committee on Science and Technology, was to evaluate and propose options for what might replace ACEE. Over 6 months, they visited the Lewis and Langley centres, 3 airframe companies and 2 engine manufacturers. They gathered interviews, milestones, projections and worries. The tone of the draft they produced was cool and sceptical. ACEE, the auditors wrote, might or might not meet its objectives. In their view, it was unclear. They allowed that there had been limited technology successes, but they emphasised how far there was to go. If some of that sounded simply like the nature of early phase research, a long runway before you lift off, the text nonetheless stung. The program was still in its early years of a 10-year arc, building and testing advanced ideas that by definition pushed past the comfortable edge of previous practice. Yet the draft pulled no punches. It pointed particularly to funding as a central obstacle. The projects with the greatest potential to save fuel, the advanced turboprop, laminar flow control, composite primary aircraft structures, were imperiled because neither the Congress nor the administration had fully committed the money they needed. Add the uncertainties together, the GAO draft said, and the prospect of meeting ACEE's objectives grew cloudy. The draft then walked through each major ACEE path, and the effect was like reading a weather report that forecast storms across the entire map. At Lewis, the engine component improvement project was labelled as falling short of its performance goals. The energy-efficient engine, still new, went into the unknown column. The advanced turboprop, so promising on paper for its fuel savings, was, the auditors wrote, at least 3 years behind schedule. Langley's portfolio fared little better. With the energy-efficient transport effort, the draft suggested that only one of the big 3 airframers, Douglas, looked positioned to fold these technologies into real aircraft, with Boeing and Lockheed lagging in that specific integration. Laminar Flow Control, the draft said, had uncertain prospects and appeared further from its goals than first thought, 4 years behind schedule. The composites program was audited for missed targets. No composite wing, no composite fuselage within the original timeframe, and for underestimating both costs and environmental concerns. There was, the GAO warned, a real hazard to consider in the release of carbon fibres, something that would need to be addressed before the technology could be widely accepted. On fuel savings, the auditors concluded, the composite path would yield dramatically less than initial projections. In Washington, words can be instruments and drafts can be alarms. On the 24th of January 1980, NASA Administrator Robert Frosch wrote back. His letter was not heated, but it was emphatic. He had consulted with leaders at Langley and Lewis. The overarching concern, he wrote, was the negative tone and the implication that ACEE was, in essence, missing the mark. He pointed out that the audit judged progress against schedules set in 1975, before the program was even underway, and before the inevitable realities of complex technology development could be seen in the round. More than this, he argued, the draft trivialized advances that were real and substantial. He called ACEE a significant contributor to the nation's aeronautics research and technology, and insisted that the results would shape transport aircraft for years to come. Frosch's defense did not stand alone. Managers at Lewis, Langley and NASA headquarters assembled a detailed reply that went line by line. It was part technical briefing, part rhetorical calibration. The GAO's portrait, they argued, presented a distorted view, one that could lead casual readers to a false impression of failure. And that false impression had consequences. Funding for the program was already precarious. If lawmakers and administration officials read unclear as unlikely, then future budgets would trend downward, and ACEE could be set up to fail. The managers urged adjustments, wording that would better reflect the reality of where the work stood, and that would shade away from an unnecessarily negative tone. The back and forth worked. When the GAO published the final report in July 1980, it read differently. The auditors explained that, given NASA's responses, they had re-evaluated their presentation and made adjustments where the tone might have been harsher than the data warranted. The opening edged away from unclear and slipped as a frame, and instead acknowledged that, in its fifth funding year, the program had already recorded technological successes that would find their way into new and derivative aeroplanes built in the early 1980s. The report named examples: improved engine parts, lighter airframe components, improved wings. It was a change of mood and of emphasis, and it mattered. The softened tone rippled into the program-by-program sections. John Kleinberg, who had helped found the ACEE task force and would later lead the Lewis Center, had argued that the auditors had not fully reckoned with the inherent uncertainties of the advanced turboprop path. Pushing a propeller to high subsonic speeds while keeping noise, vibration, and structural loads within acceptable limits was not the kind of puzzle that yielded in a season. Risk, in other words, was not failure. It was the price of discovery. The GAO's final text captured some of that nuance. Where the draft had dwelt on disagreement and doubt, the final report acknowledged that, while the use of turboprops on 1995-era commercial aircraft was still uncertain, support for the idea had grown since 1975. It was a subtle sentence, but it reflected a more rounded understanding of how opinions shift as data accumulates. One could read these edits as the outcome of a bureaucratic tug-of-war and leave it there. But inside the agency, many saw something more durable: the proof that managerial work did not end at the wind tunnel or the test stand. The politics of technology, the art of making a case, of explaining risk and schedule slips without sounding evasive, of distinguishing the truly failing path from the genuinely hard path. These skills were as necessary to the success of a research program as the equations that describe boundary layers and combustion cycles. The profile of ACEE, after the GAO's final report, looks sturdier. In August 1980, just a month after the final document appeared, Walter B. Olstead, then the acting associate administrator for Aeronautics and Space Technology, took stock with a note of earned relief. The final report, he said, now fairly stated ACEE's progress. In nearly every domain where NASA had flagged concerns in the draft, the GAO had made appropriate changes. However pointed NASA's responses might have sounded at the time, he wrote, the chance to input substantively into the process had made the result more accurate. The battle over language, at least for the moment, had been won. Yet the quiet of that victory did not last long. the administration changed. So did the political weather. The reasoned exchanges with auditors gave way to a harsher, more existential fight over whether NASA should fly the banner of aeronautics at all. Lynn Ragsdale, a political scientist who later assessed NASA's fortunes in the Reagan years, offered a framework that helps make sense of what followed. In a system of separate institutions, Congress, the presidency, the agency, each with its own sources of legitimacy and power, conflict is not an accident, but a structural feature. If policy outcomes require alignment, someone will have to spend political capital to build public awareness and support. Without that expenditure, the default is friction, drift, and sometimes retreat. In the early Reagan years, everything about that analysis felt immediate inside NASA's aeronautics halls. The skepticism that had once focused on particular projects widened to include the basic premise of NASA's role in flight. Voices argued that industry could carry the research burden, that government's place, if any, belonged elsewhere, that the marketplace would separate promising ideas from dead ends more efficiently than a government lab could. To engineers and managers who had watched a century of aviation advance by alternating between industry-led leaps and publicly supported, pre-competitive research, this argument felt incomplete. There were types of risk that private firms would not, and arguably should not, bear alone. Technologies whose payoff lay far in the future, or whose benefits would diffuse across the entire aviation ecosystem rather than accrue to a single firm. That was the kind of work ACEE embodied. Laminar flow concepts that would teach everyone how to shape surfaces more cleanly. Composite structures whose methods would radiate into airframes beyond a single model. Turboprop advances that, if they could be made acceptably quiet and reliable, might transform the fuel curve for entire classes of aircraft. At Langley, Wagner and his colleagues in the Laminar Flow Control effort felt the squeeze. The idea they championed had the austere beauty of clean physics. Make the flow over a wing stay laminar, smooth, orderly, low drag, over a greater portion of its surface, and you reduce the fuel burn without changing the rest of the aircraft at all. But coaxing air to avoid its natural tendency to trip into turbulence required precision. Surfaces had to be impeccably smooth. Suction systems had to be designed and maintained. Contamination, bugs, rain, dust had to be managed, and the benefits in real airline operations had to outweigh complexity. It was not the stuff of quick wins, and the rhetoric of the moment favoured quick wins. At Lewis, the stakes grew severe. The whisper that a base might be closed is rare in the life of a research centre. To hear it spoken aloud is rarer and more chilling. The proposals on the table, to close Lewis outright, to excise aeronautics from NASA's remit, were not just about buildings. They were about the continuity of technical communities, the webs of skill that knot together when people work side by side on shared difficult problems for years. To eliminate 1,000 aeronautics jobs would be to unspool those webs. Even if some people landed elsewhere, the pattern they had formed, the tacit knowledge that lived between them, would not be easily rewoven. The strain made earlier debates over wording feel, by comparison, almost gentle. But those earlier fights had taught lessons that now mattered, that you could not merely trust the merits of a technology program to speak for itself. That oversight, even when frustrating, was a form of engagement, and that the same patience required in the lab, test, learn, adjust, had its analogue in the policy arena. Managers who had spent months persuading auditors to revise a phrase now had to persuade policymakers, and beyond them, the public. There was also the matter of time horizons. Programs like energy-efficient transport were, in part, about the near term, taking a suite of improvements, refined wings, lighter structures, better systems, and integrating them into the next generation of derivative aircraft. Laminar Flow Control, composites, and the advanced turboprop straddled the midterm and the long. The energy-efficient engine and engine component improvement projects were somewhere between, with component-level advances that could migrate into production engines on a timetable measured in years rather than decades. Each of these carried different kinds of risk, different dependencies on test rigs, flight trials, and industry partnerships. If budgets contracted, the triage would be cruel. Cut the long-term work and you risk starving the future. Cut the near-term integration and you risked failing to show the public anything tangible soon enough to justify the spend. Meanwhile, the memory of the GAO draft hung like a cautionary tale. In that earlier moment, skepticism had been moderated by dialogue and detail. Could the same measured approach work now, when some voices were not asking for more oversight but for abolition? The answer, for a time, would be found in an unlikely pair of adversaries and a series of meetings and arguments that set the stage for what came next, as the people who believed in ACEE and in NASA's aeronautical mission worked to translate technical value into political survivability. Consider the managers who had taken the GAO's critique on composites and turned it into a chance to clarify rather than retreat. They did not deny the concerns about costs or the environmental questions around carbon fibre. Instead, they set about reframing them. If the initial wing or fuselage demonstrators would take longer and cost more than hoped, what lighter components could be fielded sooner? How could the hazard scenarios be researched, mitigated, and regulated responsibly so that a promising material would not be dismissed out of hand? The answers lived in painstaking plans, revised test matrices, and new partnerships with manufacturers, risk assessments that did not pretend away uncertainties but also did not magnify them into inevitabilities. The same pattern played out in laminar flow. Teams catalogued every cause of premature transition from smooth to turbulent flow, leading-edge contamination, surface waviness, panel joins, pressure gradients. They developed maintenance regimes and suction system designs and sought out flight test opportunities to prove that the gains seen in the tunnel could survive contact with the weather. It was the unglamorous work of making a clever idea robust. For the advanced turboprop, the oscillation between promise and peril was even more visible. Propellers conjured an older image of flight, but these were not the slow, thrumming discs of the 1940s. Engineers were sculpting slender, scimitar-shaped blades to slice the air at high subsonic speeds, squeezing fuel savings out of every increment of aerodynamic refinement. But the questions were tough. Would the propulsors be too loud for the travelling public? Could vibration be tamed without adding so much weight that the efficiency gains vanished? Could the aeroplane around the propeller handle the changed flow fields, the complex interactions between blade-tip vortices and tail? In a calmer age, those questions would read like an invitation to do science. In an age of threat, they read like a bill of indictment to those searching for reasons to cut. And yet, even in that atmosphere, the people inside NASA and their partners in industry held to the simple logic that had brought ACEE into being. Fuel mattered, efficiency mattered, and pre-competitive research could lift all ships, or, more precisely, all aeroplanes. The cash flows of airlines, the balance sheets of manufacturers, and the country's strategic posture all gained when aircraft burned less fuel to carry more payload farther. The politicians who saw only cost could be shown curves and charts that pointed to savings over time, to industries staying competitive abroad, to exports recovering their pace. It was the work of translation, turning the language of ribs and spars, of boundary layers and bypass ratios, into the language of jobs, trade balances, and national resilience. By the time the administration's most severe proposals began to circulate, closing a centre, ending a line of work, NASA's aeronautics community had already been tempered by a year of argument, by the drafting and redrafting of reports, by the felt need to be both rigorous and persuasive. People who had once lived primarily in the realm of experiments found themselves also crafting narratives that could travel from committee rooms to newspaper articles. They gathered the history of American aviation, times when industry led and government followed, times when government ceded capabilities that industry later harvested, and used that history to argue that the present moment called for partnership rather than abandonment. In the midst of all this, one can imagine a late evening in an office at Langley or Lewis, the hum of fluorescent lights, the thin paper of a budget memo, the fine pen scratches across a margin where an engineer has turned policy into a diagram, just to think. The next morning, there would be another meeting, another briefing, a gentle but firm explanation of why a laminar flow suction system wasn't a boondoggle, but a rational attempt to reduce drag. Why composite structures needed careful environmental studies, not because they were hopeless, but because they were promising and the stakes were high. Why engine component improvements mattered in the near term, while clean sheet engines would need a longer runway. These everyday acts, transparent, precise, patient, are how institutions defend themselves when the debate moves from data to doctrine. And yet, even as those arguments unfolded, events outside the agency continued to press in. Another think tank report here, another oversight letter there. Each piece added to a mosaic that, depending on where you stood, looked like a necessary course correction or a dangerous retrenchment. If you were inside the walls, where wind tunnels murmured and data scrolled across green phosphor screens, it looked like a test of whether the nation still believed in the kind of research that paid off across decades. If you were reading budget lines in an office where every request had to be justified against a dozen others, it might have looked like a contest of immediate returns. What remained constant through those days was the stubborn fact that aeronautics is both practical and aspirational. It asks for rigor and patience because the air will not be fooled and the physics will not be rushed, and it asks for imagination because every gain is a form of noticing, where the flow is smooth, where the structure can be lightened, where the cycle can be made more efficient. The ACEE program, held between those demands, faced not just the tests of engineering, but the tests of politics. The GAO episode had shown that you could influence how your work was described if you marshalled your evidence and spoke clearly. The battles that followed would determine whether that clarity could withstand an argument not about how to improve a program, but whether to keep it alive at all. As the story narrows toward its next turn, picture the people who had to walk into rooms where their audience had been primed to doubt, armed only with their charts, their prototypes, and their calm insistence that measured progress mattered. Picture, too, the policymakers who, despite ideological crosswinds, were willing to say that certain kinds of research were public goods worth supporting. Between them, and between their competing visions, lay the fate of laminar flow on wings, of composites in primary structures, of advanced propulsive concepts, and of the notion that an agency born in the heat of the space age still had an indispensable role to play in the air. Woods Hole versus the Heritage Foundation. The summer of 1980 arrived with a certain anxious brightness, and with it a simple idea. If the gale of opinion was going to blow through NASA's aeronautics work, the agency should invite the best minds in American flight to take the measure of things, openly, rigorously, and on the record. So the Aeronautics and Space Engineering Board convened an independent review of NASA's entire aeronautics portfolio. It was no ordinary gathering. The chair was Neil Armstrong, calm and precise, a figure who could knit engineers, executives, and academics into a single conversation. Arrayed around him were 23 more voices: a former Johnson Space Center director, technology chiefs and vice presidents from Douglas, Pan American, Sikorsky, United Technologies, Grumman, Boeing, General Electric, Lockheed, and professors from Stanford, MIT, and Caltech whose lectures had shaped generations of designers. For a week, the 27th of July through 2 August, the board and its invited experts occupied the National Academy of Sciences Study Center in Woods Hole, Massachusetts. 60 specialists split into 5 panels and set to work. H. Guyford Stever, who steered the week's proceedings, would later call it arduous and exhilarating, the kind of sustained inquiry that leaves pencil shavings on the table and new clarity in the air. When their deliberations coalesced into conclusions, people began referring to them simply as the Woods Hole Plan. The plan stepped into public view in a compact volume titled NASA's Role in Aeronautics, a Workshop. It did not bother with grandstanding. Instead, it traced a line back to the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics and forward through NASA, showing how the American state and the American aviation industry had, for decades, traveled together, sometimes trading the lead, sometimes marching in step, always bound by a shared story of invention. That partnership, the document argued, had been a source of competitive strength, not weakness. And yet, the authors warned, recent years had eroded that edge. A fifth of the world aircraft market had slipped from American hands to European manufacturers, not by accident, but with the backing of European governments committed to building a rival centre of gravity in the skies. If that was the strategy abroad, then answering it at home with retreat rather than resolve would be a mistake. The remedy, in the board's view, was not less American public support for aeronautics, but more. More clarity, more steadiness, more intelligent investment. Above all, fuel fixed their minds. The price and availability of energy had begun to steer the trajectories of air travel in ways few had foreseen a decade earlier. The board pointed to the steady concrete gains already recorded: cleaner aerodynamics, lighter structures and materials, thriftier propulsion, and to the keystone role played by NASA's Aircraft Energy Efficiency Program in catalyzing those gains. Leadership in aeronautics, they wrote in essence, would fall to the nations willing to move these technologies off drawing boards and test cells and into fleets. To reverse the sag in America's momentum, NASA's role in aeronautics had to be clarified and strengthened rather than pared away. If unhurried history and policy help you drift off, and you'd like more stories like this, you can quietly subscribe to Space Historian and Tap-like. It keeps these gentle explorations coming without disturbing the flow of the tale. While the board wrote in Woods Hole, strategy sessions were unfolding in a very different register. With the election still 2 months away, Reagan's campaign team was sketching what a future administration might do. Edwin Meese, the campaign's chief, preferred that the planning remain low visibility, a scaffolding for governing rather than a distraction from winning. Among the most energetic partners was the Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank born in 1973 and now brimming with plans. By October, their spokesmen were promising a comprehensive game plan to translate conservative policy ambitions into action under a vigorous White House. Budgets would be cut and balanced, moral purpose restored, the very shape of government reconsidered. It was, as one headline had it, a blueprint for building a conservative government. For NASA, the season felt thin and brittle. In September, John Noble Wilford of the New York Times watched a Delta rocket loft a weather satellite from Cape Canaveral and wrote that the launch might mark the end of NASA as we know it. The words captured a mood. The space shuttle had yet to fly, and its early manifest had become a telling symbol. Of the first 17 missions on the books, NASA defined only 2, with the Pentagon claiming most of the rest. The Department of Defense was spending freely on satellites and rockets. NASA, once an emblem of autonomous exploration, was beginning to look like a service provider for other nations and agencies. Money tightened. Neither presidential candidate seemed eager to spend political capital on the space agency. In October, Administrator Robert Frosch announced he would step down on Inauguration Day. Inside the centres and at headquarters, people waited for the vote and wondered what kind of wind it would bring. They did not wait long for a signal. 12 days after the election, the Heritage Foundation issued Mandate for Leadership, a thick, insistent book of recommendations that the Los Angeles Times called a quick strike, a fast, disciplined attempt to reframe nearly half a century of policy. It proposed abolishing the Department of Energy, devolving much of the Environmental Protection Agency's work to states or other federal entities, and adding $20 billion to the defense budget. Admirers called it the most complete report on government ever written. Critics predicted savage opposition. Mises' enthusiastic backing helped place it on the Washington Post's bestseller list for weeks, and the volume soon became the administration's working manual. Running through its chapters was a doctrine that would touch aeronautics directly. Government, the authors argued, should step back from the commercialization of technology. There were clear exceptions: nuclear work, weapons labs, certain strategic functions, but on the whole, technology meant for markets should be carried by markets. Aviation was not among the exceptions. Generally, the report concluded, the federal government should not involve itself in commercialization. ACEE was not, strictly speaking, a commercialization program, but it did push the line further down the development road than NASA's typical aeronautics work. That alone made it vulnerable. George A. Keyworth, who would serve as Reagan's science advisor from 1981 to 1985, gave the philosophy a forward-looking gloss. This was a new era for American industry and for industrial research and development. With the constraints of government softened, companies would have new room to be inventive, but they would also be challenged to fund work that, in earlier years, had been supported from the public purse. A companion heritage analysis, Agenda for Progress, spoke with even less equivocation about NASA's aeronautics line. By their tally, the agency was spending roughly $500 million a year on civil and military aeronautical research, and the authors could find no sound justification for federal money in that domain. Worse, they argued, NASA siphoned engineers away from profitable industrial work into careers aligned with a political agenda. Keep this policy going, they warned, and American leadership would erode rather than strengthen. Taxpayers should not shoulder this burden. Aircraft firms should finance their own research. Their end state was stark: abolish NASA's aeronautics program. Anger crackled through engineering offices when those words were read, but surprise did not. NASA had been preparing its counter case. The Woods Hole report arrived as a timely anchor. A senior official wrote to Donald Norred that the plan was a strong endorsement at precisely the right moment. Administrators began using it as a primer for members of Congress, a way to raise the level of conversation and remind lawmakers that aeronautical gains often sprout from pre-competitive research nobody firm alone will fund. In February 1981, Acting Administrator Alan Lovelace sent letters and copies of the Woods Hole document to the chairs and members of every committee and subcommittee with a hand on aviation matters. At the same time, Walter Olstad, the Acting Associate Administrator for Aeronautics and Space Technology, launched a parallel effort. Too many people, he wrote, simply did not understand how NASA chose, managed, and measured its aeronautics programs. He wanted the report to serve as a clear public statement of purpose, explaining what the agency did in the air and why it mattered to the nation. he circulated it to centre directors, Donald P. Harth at Langley, John F. McCarthy at Lewis, and made sure they had the full ACEE materials to hand. Then early in February 1981, the White House announced a 9% cut to NASA's budget. The Washington Post reported that the depth of the reduction surprised even the agency's top leadership. No public list yet detailed which lines would be trimmed, but nobody needed to read tea leaves to know that, inside a constricting envelope, Aeronautics would be asked to yield, with the agency as a whole scrambling to defend its core. ACEE's managers worried that the very successes they were nursing would be starved before they could fly. Donald Norrid decided the moment called for something that engineers do not always relish: marketing. In January, even before the formal cuts were announced, he had drafted guidance on advocacy for aeronautics, plain-spoken notes on how to frame a case, how to present a program's purpose without jargon, how to answer skeptical questions without defensiveness. Effective advocacy, he wrote, was essential to NASA's health. Those pages soon became a kind of field manual for the Aeronautics Directorate as they set out to win congressional support for new starts and to shield the most promising work already in progress. Walter Stewart, who directed aeronautics at Lewis, did not mince words. This emphasis on advocacy was vital to their well-being. In March 1981, Lovelace carried that argument into a committee room on Capitol Hill for NASA's budget hearings. He did not pretend the nation's largest problem was anything but the economy. What he proposed, instead, was that aviation could serve as a model for reclaiming global economic leadership. Then he laid out, without melodrama, the particulars that worried him. For the first time, a major US airline had ordered an entire fleet of foreign-built aircraft. Across the world, the French-led Airbus consortium was outselling America's most advanced transport by roughly 3-1. Enrollment in university aeronautics courses had slumped to historic lows. And in the middle of this, NASA faced the curtailment of its air programs under a new governing philosophy: let industry go it alone. Lovelace did not rant. He reached for an image most listeners would recognize, saying that the message was, as an old Bob Dylan lyric had it, blowing in the wind. Then he did what the Woods Hole authors had done. He reminded the room that American leadership in aviation had never been an accident. It had been tended, first by the NACA, then by NASA, always in collaboration with industry, always in service of capabilities that would be broadly shared. In his judgment, and in the judgment of experts from government, industry, and universities, NASA needed to keep at its aeronautical research, not to smother competition but to nourish it, to help stir the airlines industry and strengthen the American economy. The operating model had worked for decades. Government labs pushing the frontiers with industry close at hand, each learning from the other, each pulling the country along. In a moment when foreign competition pressed hard on American leadership, there seemed no reason to unpick that weave. During the budget hearings, Acting Administrator Alan Lovelace aimed his words squarely at the new president. "Keep the light burning," he urged. "Keep the beacon bright, and provide the fuel to do it." It was a simple image, almost homespun, meant to cut through spreadsheets and talking points to the heart of the matter. Sustained research keeps the flame alive. If you find these calm, true stories about flight and policy soothing as you drift off, you can quietly subscribe to Space Historian and Tap Like. It helps keep these gentle journeys coming without disturbing the flow. The plea landed with a modest thud. When the numbers were finally set, NASA's budget was trimmed by $219 million. The space shuttle kept its support. Aeronautics did not. $33 million disappeared from the airside compared with the previous year. Within ACEE, $7 million vanished. most of it, 5.5, carved out of the energy-efficient engine effort. Laminar Flow Control kept its line alive, but the price was time. Key ground evaluations pushed back 2 years. Lovelace, measured even in disappointment, called the reductions significant but not crippling. The word crippling, though, would find other targets soon enough. Even after the spring skirmish over the budget, larger shapes moved on the horizon. The Office of Management and Budget, taking its cue from the White House, continued to press a plan that would alter NASA at the root, slicing off aeronautics and handing much of the future to the marketplace. That was the moment when unlikely allies stepped out of their lanes. Leaders in the Department of Defense and voices in Congress began to argue, on their own terms, that a surgical removal of NASA's air research was a mistake. In November 1981, Caspar Weinberger, the Secretary of Defense, learned what the OMB plan would mean in practice. Lewis Research Center would close. More than 1,000 aeronautics jobs across NASA would vanish. The agency might continue to offer help on military aircraft, but civil aviation, the well from which so much dual-use knowledge had flowed, would be left to fend for itself. This was happening just as the nation was preparing to expand its defense posture. Weinberger looked at the timing and saw a risk to the very programs he was charged with strengthening. The B-1B bomber and other projects did not rise in a vacuum. They drew on a broad technical base, people, facilities, methods that NASA helped sustain. He wrote to David Stockman, the OMB director, to say as much. The proposed reductions would harm the work the Pentagon needed, and before any closures or amputations were carried out, the Department of Defense should have its chance to weigh the consequences. The fact that Weinberger had earned the nickname Cap the Knife in budget circles made his intervention all the more striking. Here was a renowned cutter arguing to keep a limb attached. He asked his Undersecretary, Richard DeLauer, to move quickly. On the 30th of November 1981, DeLauer wrote to James Beggs, NASA's administrator, confirming what rumor had already spread. The OMB was proposing major reductions to the 1983 Aeronautics technology budget. The blueprint included shutting Lewis, scaling back aeronautics at Ames and Langley, and eliminating roughly 1,300 aeronautics positions across the agency. Many advanced defense programs, DeLauer argued, were critically dependent on a vigorous NASA aeronautics enterprise. There was a broader point too that often goes unsaid until it is threatened. The manufacture of civil aircraft does not only feed the economy, it sustains the industrial base, the skilled workforce, the suppliers, the test facilities that the Defense Department relies upon when conditions surge. Sever the civil limb, and the military loses strength as well. Not everyone would agree with that logic in later years. A decade on, Administrator Daniel Goldin would pull NASA back from some of the defense ties that had offered cover through lean times. As Joseph Chambers later remarked, once those cords were cut, the military laboratories built up their own expertise and, in the process, forgot who NASA was. But in the autumn of 1981, the argument for keeping the connection, civil aeronautics feeding the wider industrial and defense base, was front and center. The Army added its weight. On the 1st of December 1981, J.R. Scully, the Assistant Secretary of the Army, wrote to Beggs with the same mix of confirmation and warning. The partnership with NASA, he said, was essential to the Army's research and development. The expertise locked inside the centers and the unique facilities they operated could not be replicated cheaply or quickly. Eliminate them, and the Army would be forced to seek additional funds to make up the shortfall, a perverse result if the goal was to spend less. In other words, the proposed cure risked costing more than the disease. On the Hill, a congressman from Kansas, Dan Glickman, turned his committee's attention to fundamentals. As chair of the Subcommittee on Transportation, Aviation and Materials, he set a hearing with a plain-spoken title, The First A in NASA. The A, of course, stood for Aeronautics. He wanted a record, built in daylight, of the federal role's history and value, and a sober judgment about whether it should continue. His invitations to industry were direct. Some in the administration, he wrote in November, were talking about drastic curtailment. That would be a radical departure. Before accepting any such shift, Congress needed to understand the consequences in full. He sent letters to the major airframe and engine makers, General Electric among them, and scheduled the hearing for the 8th of December 1981. The nation's front pages barely noticed. The big headlines in those days belonged to the shuttle's progress and to the dreams of a probe for Halley's Comet, but inside the circles that would feel the cuts, the hearings mattered. In Cleveland, where Lewis anchored a network of jobs and tax revenues, the news felt personal. Mary Rose Oka, who represented the district, fought to keep the center alive. She invited the president to visit and see what was at risk, describing Lewis as a beacon of high-technology research. If the OMB plan went ahead, she argued, Ohio would lose more than paychecks. It would lose standing in the quiet economy of expertise. When the witnesses gathered for the first A, Thomas Donahue, general manager of General Electric's Aircraft Engines Group, reminded the room of what the NACA and then NASA had given the country: a steady stream of improvements, often pre-competitive, that industry could carry into products. Others from airframe and engine companies followed with similar notes. Glickman, hearing a consensus, followed up. He sent letters to the chief executives. To Jack Welch at GE, he praised Donahue's testimony and urged Welch to write directly to President Reagan, adding his voice in favor of keeping aeronautics where it belonged, inside NASA's remit. One of the Heritage Foundation's favorite arguments was that aeronautics had matured. The government no longer needed to water a tree that had reached its full height. ACEE's supporters did not accept the metaphor. Brian Rowe, a senior vice president at General Electric, took the question from Victor H. Rees at the Office of Science and Technology Policy head on. Is aeronautics stagnant? No, he answered with no hedging. With sustained research, the next 20 years could match the previous 40 in pace of progress. He pointed to fuel efficiency as a living example and made a concrete prediction. By 2002, the fuel burned per passenger on an inaugural airliner flight could be 40 to 50% lower than the first revenue flight of the new Boeing 767 scheduled for later that year. Far from being mature, the field still held steep gradients to climb, and ACEE was helping to map the route. When NASA returned for its February 1982 budget hearings, the earlier session, the first A, had done its work. Glickman reported that the proceedings showed something rare in Washington: unanimity in rejecting the idea that industry should shoulder aeronautics research alone while NASA stepped aside. And still, the OMB pressed on. A headline in Defense Daily said out loud what many had begun to assume: cuts were forcing NASA to close Lewis. In the corridors of Washington, the closure felt inevitable, a fait accompli. Aerospace Daily ran with another blunt line: the Aircraft Energy Efficiency Program was marked for elimination. It didn't seem to matter that Langley and Lewis had posted real gains. The philosophy and fashion frowned on programs that delivered benefits to industry. ACEE, by design, did just that. It fell crosswise with the grain, and yet the announcements proved premature. Cuts came, and they hurt, but they did not wipe the slate clean. With the Defense Department, industry leaders, members of Congress, and NASA's own advocates all pushing back against the notion that aeronautics was a luxury, the administration relented enough to let the line limp on. It was not triumph, but it was survival. NASA responded not only with defense, but with direction. Hans Mark, who led Ames Research Center, took point on an effort to craft a strategic plan for aeronautics that would look beyond the present fight. Jack L. Kerrebrock, the Associate Administrator for Aeronautics and Space Technology, explained in February 1982 that the plan would offer long-range goals and near-term guidance for the 1984 budget. When it appeared, the strategic plan for aeronautics read like a reaffirmation as much as a roadmap. It set out mission statements tying aeronautics to national policy and argued, quietly but firmly, to maintain all the existing research centres and the particular strengths each had grown over time. Nowhere did that argument feel more urgent than in Cleveland. In July 1982, Lewis organised a Save the Centre committee, drawing in the Ohio delegation and the state's senators, John Glenn and Howard Metzenbaum. Around the same time, the centre's director, John McCarthy, stepped down. Andrew Stofan, a veteran of Lewis with deep roots in its launch vehicle successes, stepped in. Some worried about the timing, a leadership change in the midst of a storm, but Stofan brought energy and the kind of persuasive confidence that can shift the weather in Washington. He began with a clear-eyed review and, just as quickly, started sketching not only how to keep the doors open, but how to make the place matter more. Inside NASA, a strategic plan committee led by William Red Robbins and Joseph Sevo set Stofan a blunt goal: bring back 5 major new programs for Lewis. He went to Washington and returned with 4, and an indefinite stay of execution. Robbins called it a damn miracle, the sort of result that depends on both arguments and relationships. Among the programs Stofan fought to keep was ACEE's advanced turboprop project, still controversial, still promising. Aeronautics across the agency was weaker in budgetary terms than it had been, but it had not been erased. The 2 long-horizon, higher-risk ACEE bets, advanced turboprop at Lewis and Laminar Flow Control at Langley, still had living chances to reach clear outcomes and, at last, program resolution.